Samsung's beginnings in Daegu. In 1938, in a Korea that was still rural, impoverished, and under Japanese occupation, a young man from a well-off family walked through the dusty streets of Daegu with a fixed idea in his mind: to build a business that would allow him to go beyond the limitations of his time, to escape inertia, to seize every corner of commerce moving between villages and ports, and to transform that energy into a company that at first seemed small, almost insignificant, a simple trading house, dealing in basic goods, but one that carried within it the outsized ambition of its founder, Lee Byung-chul. That year he opened Samsung Sanghoe, a company dedicated to selling noodles, dried fish, fruits, and other goods shipped to China, and in that gesture, one that for many would have been just another act of survival, in a struggling country he was taking the first step toward a destiny no one could possibly imagine. While this young man arranged sacks, boxes, and accounts in his modest office, you are, years later, listening to this story perhaps from your bed, your couch, or your workplace, on a quiet night when you feel like disconnecting with a good tale of entrepreneurship. And before we continue, I am genuinely curious to know from which part of the world and at what time you are joining tonight. I would love to read you in the comments, because in the end, this journey through Samsung's history intersects with your own experience of the technology that surrounds you today. To understand what it meant for Lee to open a company in that context, you have to visualize the atmosphere of the moment. Korea was not a land of giant factories or skyscrapers, but an agricultural nation with an exhausted people, pressured economically and politically by the Japanese Empire, where resources were controlled and opportunities seemed reserved for a select few. Even so, within that rigid environment arose a generation of Koreans who felt the need to do something different, who sought to take advantage of whatever cracks the system allowed in order to build businesses, organize supply chains, and quietly erect the early pillars of what, decades later, would be called the Korean economic miracle. And one of the names forever linked to that miracle is precisely Samsung. When Lee Byung-chul chose the name for his company, he did not do so at random. In the mentality of the time, a name was not just decoration on a signboard, but a declaration of intent. He chose Samsung, which in Korean can be translated as 3 stars, an expression suggesting greatness, longevity, and brightness, an aspiration to endure, to stand out, to be remembered. He did not own massive factories, nor teams of engineers, nor automated production lines. He essentially had warehouses, contacts within the trading world, and a huge appetite for risk. But the name already revealed the kind of vision that pushed him forward, to create something that rose above everyday mediocrity and refused to settle for merely surviving the next winter. In its earliest days, Samsung Sanghoe was almost a fragile organism, exposed to the storms of politics and economics, because it depended on transport routes, access to goods, and agreements with suppliers and buyers that, under colonial rule, were always under threat. Yet it was precisely this hostile environment that forced Lee to refine a skill that would accompany him throughout his entrepreneurial life: the ability to move with flexibility, to find opportunities where others saw obstacles, to negotiate with different actors without losing sight of the long-term goal, and to instill discipline into every aspect of the business, from accounting to logistics. The company's day-to-day operations were practically artisanal, full of seemingly small details that nevertheless made all the difference. Ensuring the noodles arrived in good condition, that the dried fish did not spoil during transport, that pallets were well organized, that deadlines were met, that debts were collected with precision. That obsession with detail, an obsession we would later see applied to the manufacturing of televisions, semiconductors, and phones, was born here with something as simple as a well-delivered bag of merchandise, because in a business of narrow margins, any logistical error could destroy you, and Lee knew it. In this first chapter of Samsung's story, there was still no technological innovation, no spectacular designs, no global marketing campaigns. But there was something essential to any entrepreneur: an understanding that commerce was not limited to buying and selling, but to building networks of trust, refining processes, and learning from the ground one walks every day. That is why Lee made such an effort to learn the roots, to understand where money was lost and where it was earned, to train the people who worked with him, and to maintain a reputation for reliability in an environment where one's word and punctuality were nearly the only guarantees available. As the company grew stronger, Daegu became the small center of Lee's universe, a place from which he watched the country slowly change and political tension mount. He took note of these shifts, sensed that the future would not forever lie in traditional commerce, that things would move toward industry and other sectors. But in the meantime, he used each day to reinforce his structure, expand his product portfolio, and prepare the economic base that would eventually allow him to take far greater leaps. This is one of the most powerful lessons of this period. Major business transformations often begin with modest enterprises, as long as their founder is thinking in the long term. On a personal level, Lee was not a romantic figure in the classical sense, not the isolated inventor in a garage, but rather the pragmatic strategist who could read reality and maneuver within it with intelligence. And although he came from a family with resources, his success was not guaranteed, because Korea, in the late 1932s and early 1940s, was an unstable board, a place where war and politics could erase entire companies overnight. That sense of historical fragility was present from Samsung's first day, and perhaps that is why the founder acted with such intensity, trying to seize every window of opportunity before it closed. If we look at it from today's perspective, from a world where Samsung is synonymous with phones, screens, and cutting-edge technology, these early steps in the food trade may seem like a distant anecdote. Yet in reality, they are the seed of everything that would come later. The expansionist mentality, the constant pursuit of new sectors, the ability to manage complex supply chains, and, above all, the ambition for the company to become a pillar of the Korean economy, something that at the time was nothing more than a dream, albeit a dream supported by very concrete and demanding decisions. The story is about to take a drastic turn, because darkening clouds were already gathering over this small commercial empire. The approaching end of Japanese occupation, ideological tensions, the division of the peninsula, and ultimately the war that would split Korea in two and force Lee Byung-chul to flee, to lose part of what he had built, and to face a test that would challenge not only his business but his ability to reinvent himself amid chaos. This is where the deeper transformation that follows begins. War, flight, and reinvention. As the decade of the 1940s advances, the entire world seems to slide toward an abyss, and Korea is trapped between forces far greater than itself. Because Japanese rule reaches its most strained point, the Second World War keeps consuming resources and lives, and the small merchant from Daegu, who had found a way to prosper by sending products to China, begins to notice that the ground beneath his feet is trembling. The trains stop being reliable, the routes become dangerous, the restrictions intensify, and the business turns into an obstacle course in which each passing day makes it slightly harder to maintain the rhythm. Yet it is precisely in that period that a notion forms in the mind of Lee Byung-chul, a notion that will later define his trajectory. If the environment changes in a brutal way, the only way to survive is to be willing to change with it, even if that means leaving behind what worked yesterday. In 1945, with the Japanese defeat and the end of the war, Korea experiences a moment of apparent relief, mixed with a strange sense of uncertainty, because the occupation ends, but the country does not awaken in peace. Instead, it finds itself on a geopolitical board, split in two. To the north, Soviet influence; to the south, American influence; and in between, millions of people who are not entirely sure what will become of their future. For an entrepreneur of Lee's caliber, that means something very concrete. No structure is guaranteed, and any business that does not adapt to the new reality will be short-lived. In that context of transition, Samsung Sangho stretches as much as it can, trying to take advantage of the hunger for reconstruction, serving a country that needs food, basic goods, and a minimum of commercial stability. While Lee begins to look beyond the simple exchange of merchandise, the political climate becomes tense with speed. Ideological pressures rise as if someone were slowly turning up the volume. And by the late 1940s, the conflict between the North and the South is no longer concealed. The cities begin to fill with rumors, the newspapers talk more and more about an imminent clash, and the entrepreneurs who understand the volatile nature of history start to take positions, moving offices, strengthening contacts, accumulating reserves, and preparing for a possible rupture that many prefer not to name aloud in order not to give it form. Lee, who refuses to be deceived by reassuring speeches, perceives that his country is sliding towards something immense and dangerous, and that intuition pushes him to think that his trade business, as it was conceived, will no longer be enough to navigate what is coming. When the Korean War breaks out in 1950, those intuitions turn into brutal facts. Troops cross the 38th parallel, cities change hands. Seoul falls and is taken back several times. Hundreds of thousands of people flee southward, and in the midst of all that chaos, the economic fabric of the country tears apart everywhere. Warehouses are looted, routes collapse, offices are abandoned, workers scatter as they try to save their families, and entrepreneurs are forced to make decisions that no business plan anticipates. Lee Byung-chul is part of that wave of displaced civilians. He leaves behind facilities and assets and withdraws to the south, toward Busan, with a mixture of loss and stubbornness, understanding that his first task is not to grow the company but to ensure that it still exists once the bombs stop falling. It is in that stage of flight and survival that the difference between a merchant who resigns himself and a founder who thinks in long-term terms becomes clear, because while many limit themselves to preserving the little they have left, Lee uses the chaos as a sort of forced laboratory in which he observes what people need, what the market demands in the midst of destruction, and what can be produced in a devastated environment. He sees lines forming for basic foods, perceives the importance of sugar as a source of energy and as a raw material for other products, and begins to shape the idea that the future of his group cannot depend solely on trade, but on the capacity to manufacture what the country will desperately need in the post-war period. When the armistice arrives in 1953, the landscape of South Korea is devastated, with cities reduced to rubble, infrastructures destroyed, and a population that has paid a terrible price. But, paradoxically, that scenario opens an enormous window for those willing to devote their lives to reconstruction. Factories must be built, roads must be rebuilt, homes must be raised, distribution systems must be restored, and above all, the supply of basic products must be secured so the population can resume a minimally dignified life. It is in that context that Lee decides to take one of the most important turns in the history of the group: the creation of a company dedicated to sugar, which will become Chaebol, a decisive step into the food industry and toward a business model based on producing and not merely trading. That move is not a simple change of sector, it is a change of philosophy, because it meant building factories, investing in machinery, hiring workers on a massive scale, managing industrial processes, learning from chemists, engineers, and technicians, and accepting that the margin for error shrinks when one enters the field of production. The risk is enormous, but the potential reward is also enormous, because a country emerging from war will need tons of processed foods, sugar for direct consumption and for other industries, and companies capable of supplying that demand become fundamental actors in national reconstruction. Lee understands that if Samsung wants to be relevant in the new order of South Korea, it must be at the heart of that productive machinery. Alongside sugar comes another strategic bet, the textile sector, which takes shape in Chaebol, a company focused on producing fabrics and on creating what would become the largest wool spinning mill in Korea. At first glance, it may appear that moving from selling agricultural products to manufacturing textiles is an erratic jump, but in reality, it responds to a logic of national reconstruction, because a country emerging from war needs to clothe its population, develop export industries, and generate foreign currency, and textiles become an ideal gateway to connect with foreign markets. From Lee's perspective, moreover, entering this sector means continuing to deepen the idea of controlling the value chain. From raw material to final product, every link he controls increases his room for maneuver. The transition from merchant to industrialist does not happen overnight, nor does it unfold as a clean and perfect story. There are internal conflicts, a lack of technical experience, quality problems, difficulties in obtaining financing in a still fragile country, and tensions with a political environment in which the state exerts a strong influence on the economic direction, supporting certain companies as national champions while demanding loyalty, results, and a level of discipline that borders on constant pressure. In that complex relationship with power, Samsung begins to form itself as one of the conglomerates that will play a key role in the development of South Korea, and Lee learns to move along that fine line between collaboration and dependence. As sugar and textile factories rise, the spirit of the former merchant from Daegu remains present in the way the business is run, because experience in the world of trade taught Lee to value the importance of networks, partners, deadlines, and reputation, and now he applies that same sensitivity on a much larger scale. Each new plant is not merely a building filled with machines, but a node within a network that he dreams of expanding to encompass banking, insurance, construction, and many more sectors, even if for the moment that future vision appears in the form of discrete decisions and small companies gradually increasing the group's reach. By the end of this stage, what began as a shop selling agricultural products has survived a colonization, a world war, a civil war, and a forced displacement, and has emerged from all of it transformed into a collection of industrial companies intimately linked to the country's reconstruction project. The price has been high, the human and material losses enormous. But in the mind of Lee Byung-chul, there is a certainty that will guide his next steps. If Samsung has been able to withstand the fire of history, it will also be able to grow in times of peace, expanding into sectors that still seem distant, such as electronics and technology, which will gradually come closer until they become the new horizon of his ambition. From store to family Chaebol, when the post-war period begins to stabilize and South Korea enters the 1950 seconds with more uncertainties than certainties, Lee Byung-chul realizes that his company has reached a point where devoting his energy solely to sugar and textiles would limit a potential he perceives as far greater, because the entire country is undergoing a reconstruction so deep that it creates opportunities in nearly every sector, from financial services to construction, from international trade to consumer goods. The idea of expanding, which during the war had been a survival instinct, now becomes a deliberate strategy. Samsung must behave like an entity that branches out, multiplies, and occupies the empty spaces of a national economy that needs companies capable of moving quickly to sustain growth. It is at this stage that the group begins to acquire the features of what would later be known as a Chaebol, a complex business structure dominated by a family, with multiple companies under a single vision, and with enough influence to become a central actor in the country's economic advancement. The 1950 seconds and 1960 seconds are a crucible of government plans, international aid, infrastructure projects, and desperate efforts to build export-oriented industries that can pull South Korea out of stagnation. In this climate, the companies able to align themselves with the state's objectives and diversify with discipline can earn a privileged position. Lee quickly understands that the path does not lie in specializing in a single sector, but in building an interconnected network of companies that reinforce each other. For that reason, Samsung enters fields such as insurance, finance, banking, foreign trade, transportation, and construction. Each new subsidiary functions as a piece of a puzzle that expands methodically, but with a very clear internal logic, to occupy as many points of the economic chain as possible in order to reduce external dependence and create an ecosystem capable of resisting future crises. The family structure also begins to take shape during this period. In a country where institutional frameworks are still developing, the deepest trust is not placed in shareholder meetings or independent boards, but in the inner circle, siblings, children, and those who share a vision and a loyalty built on blood and years. For Lee, this form of management is not a whim but a tool for maintaining control and ensuring that his decisions are not diluted in endless discussions. In the corporate culture of Korea at the time, this concentration of power is almost a standard and is perceived as a competitive advantage. The family leads, decides, adjusts the course, and does not waste time justifying every move to outsiders. Over the years, this structure would become controversial, but in this historical moment it is one of the engines enabling a speed of execution that other groups in the country envy. At the same time, the relationship between the state and the business groups grows increasingly close. The government promotes policies of accelerated industrialization and selects certain conglomerates as pillars of its growth strategy, supporting them with loans, tax benefits, and access to key projects. Samsung, which is already demonstrating a remarkable ability to diversify and to execute complex plans quickly, enters that sphere of companies considered essential for the country's future. Public-private collaboration is not simple. It is full of tensions, obligations, and expectations, but it provides access to resources that would be impossible to obtain independently in a poor and still unstable country. In return, Samsung becomes committed to a national development vision that demands constant progress, adaptability, and a level of discipline that will mark the company's character forever. This period is also defined by a climate of enormous social sacrifice. South Korea is undergoing a harsh transformation marked by endless workdays, a population devoted to reconstruction, and a government obsessed with turning the country into a development model. Samsung absorbs that spirit and turns it into part of its corporate culture. Each subsidiary functions as a gear within a machine that cannot stop, because stopping would mean falling behind, and falling behind would mean slipping back into the poverty that left such deep wounds during the war. The company organizes itself to operate with strict discipline, high expectations for every worker, and a long-term vision that merges business ambition with historical responsibility. As the group grows, it begins to develop something beyond sheer economic volume, an identity. Samsung stops being a collection of disconnected businesses and begins to operate as a coherent entity, with a leadership style, a particular way of making decisions, and an internal culture that values extreme effort, rapid execution, and an almost obsessive ambition to climb ranks in any sector it enters. Although the company is still far from electronics and the technological universe, the spirit that will make that leap possible is already germinating, because constant diversification forces the group to learn, to absorb knowledge from different industries, and to adapt to shifting environments with an aggressiveness that will later become one of its strongest competitive advantages. In parallel, the Lee family begins to project a public image that blends prestige, economic power, and a form of leadership many see as an extension of the national project. Being the founder or heir of a Chaebol implies a privileged position, but also an immense burden. The pressure to deliver results, to expand, and to maintain internal stability within the group is constant, and every decision has a massive impact on thousands of workers. During the 1,960 seconds, Samsung goes from being a relevant company to becoming an indispensable institution in the nation's economy, and this rapid rise shapes a relationship between the family and the country that will define the group's history for decades. Throughout this process, what stands out most from an entrepreneurial perspective is Lee's ability to read the historical moment and act without waiting for conditions to become perfect. Every entry into a new sector is guided by a mixture of intuition, national need, and business opportunity. But once the decision is made, execution is relentless. The group does not scatter or fragment, because every expansion responds to a clear vision of building a business framework capable of withstanding any future crisis. That vision is what transforms Samsung into a Chaebol, a family conglomerate with immense economic power, a network of interdependent companies, and a project that transcends quarterly results. By the end of this stage, the transformation is undeniable. What began as a simple trading house is no longer merely an industrial company, but a rapidly expanding conglomerate that is beginning to define the economic structure of South Korea. And in that landscape still marked by the scars of war, Samsung prepares for a leap that will forever change its place in the world, a leap into a sector that at the time seems reserved for far more developed countries, but that will soon become the center of its modern identity. The brave leap into electronics. At the beginning of the 1960s, when South Korea was still struggling to leave behind the image of a destroyed country and begin to see itself as an emerging industrial nation, the conglomerate that Lee Byung-chul had built already had a considerable size, with sugar factories, textiles, insurance companies, banking, and construction. But in the mind of the founder, a restlessness began to appear, one that could not be calmed with new buildings or positive financial statements, a sensation that the true future did not lie in what the country already knew how to do, but in territories that seemed too sophisticated for a nation that was still learning to walk within the modern economy. While many business owners felt comfortable consolidating what they had achieved, Lee looked toward a world where the key words were electronics, technology, and communications, and he felt that if he wanted Samsung to truly transcend Korean borders, he had to take the risk of entering a sector that, for almost everyone, was reserved for foreign giants. In Korean cities, the first signs of that future arrived in the form of objects that seemed almost magical to the population. Radios that brought distant voices into very humble rooms, black and white televisions installed in bars and shops where people gathered to watch imported programs, expensive devices that usually carried Japanese or United States brands, and that symbolized a sort of promise, the promise of belonging to a modern world dominated by image and sound. Each of those televisions was, at the same time, an uncomfortable reminder of the country's technological dependence, because most of those products came from abroad. And for an entrepreneur with strategic thinking like Lee, that translated into a silent question that followed him every time he saw a living room illuminated by the light of a screen. How long can a country that aspires to be strong continue importing the technology that entertains and informs its own people? By the end of the decade, the South Korean government began pressing more strongly for large companies to make a qualitative leap and enter sectors of greater added value, encouraging the production of electronic goods, automobiles, and, later, semiconductors. In that atmosphere of ambitious industrial policies, Lee found the perfect environment to materialize his obsession. In the year 1969, Samsung took a step that many considered reckless. It founded Samsung Electronics and Samsung Electromechanics, and decided to build a complex destined to become the technological heart of the group in the city of Suwon, a few kilometers south of Seoul, in an area that, at that time, was barely beginning to develop. On land that until very recently had been fields and dusty roads, a space was planned that aspired to be something more than a factory, a true industrial campus where engineers, technicians, and operators could learn to speak the language of electronics. The financial gamble was enormous for the standards of the era and of the country, because manufacturing televisions and other devices was not simply a matter of assembling a couple of production lines and hiring inexpensive labor. It required importing and developing technology, signing agreements with foreign companies, sending personnel to study processes in other countries, and accepting a painful learning curve in terms of errors, defective products, and initial losses. Many within the conglomerate itself looked with suspicion at this project that seemed to swallow resources without offering immediate results. But Lee was convinced that the risk of not entering electronics was even greater because it would leave Samsung trapped in sectors where, sooner or later, other competitors could catch up. The first products that came out of the Suwon lines were simple black and white televisions, modest models when compared with the most renowned Japanese brands of the time. But for the Korean market, they had something special. They carried a name that sounded familiar, close, a name that had already been present in sugar, in textiles, and in services, and that now appeared on the front of a device that quickly became the center of attention in every home that could afford it. In the beginning, many parts were imported, technological integration was still limited, and Samsung's engineers spent hours analyzing, disassembling, and reassembling devices to learn how they worked inside, taking detailed notes, detecting flaws, discovering the secrets of a craft that was still in its infancy within the country. The learning process was harsh. Batches were produced that did not meet the desired standards. Frequent breakdowns appeared. Customer complaints were received. Weaknesses in quality control systems were discovered. But far from becoming discouraged, management used each setback as an opportunity to strengthen the internal culture of the new division. Stricter review protocols were designed. Managers were required to analyze in detail the origin of each failure. Training routines were implemented for operators, and little by little the factory stopped being a place of clumsy experiments and became a center where a mixture of industrial discipline and technological curiosity was breathed. That combination of rigor and constant learning would become one of the hallmarks of Samsung Electronics in the decades that followed. At the same time, the group understood that controlling the device was not enough. That to consolidate its position in the emerging Korean television market, it also needed to intervene in the content that was broadcast, in the way the population related to the screen. That is why Samsung became involved in the broadcasting business through TBC, Tongyang Broadcasting Company, a private channel that would become one of the major media players in the country until its later integration into public television. The logic behind this move was clear. If the group was capable of producing the televisions and providing part of the programs people watched on them, it would have an advantage in brand building and in understanding the consumption habits of its audience. In this way, hardware and content began to walk hand in hand under the same business orbit. Entering electronics also forced Samsung to change its way of thinking about talent. It was no longer enough to have managers experienced in commerce or traditional manufacturing. It needed engineers trained in electronics, specialists in components, technicians capable of diagnosing circuit failures and designing solutions. The group began recruiting young graduates from technical universities, and some were sent abroad to train in factories in Japan, the United States, and Europe, with the mission of returning and transferring that acquired knowledge to the rest of the workforce. This circulation of talent generated a cultural clash within the company, because veteran executives, accustomed to more tangible businesses, lived alongside a new generation that handled concepts and tools still abstract for many. That clash, however, became a creative force. The old guard contributed discipline, a sense of responsibility, and the ability to manage large-scale projects, while the newcomers brought fresh ideas, different working methods, and an almost unbreakable faith in the potential of technology. Gradually, Samsung stopped being seen only as a giant of traditional industry and began to be associated with the image of modernity, especially among young Koreans who saw in televisions and electronics a gateway to a lifestyle more connected with the rest of the world. As quality improved and production capacity increased, the group's gaze extended beyond the domestic market. South Korea remained a country limited in size, so any company aspiring to grow sustainably had to think about exporting. Samsung executives began studying markets in Asia, the Middle East, and other destinations where demand for televisions and household appliances was beginning to rise, and the idea that a device manufactured in Suwon could end up in the living room of a family on another continent stopped being a fantasy and became a concrete objective. The brand began its slow path through trade fairs, catalogs, and agreements with foreign distributors, planting the seed of what in later decades would become its global dominance in consumer electronics. By the end of this stage, the weight of electronics in the conglomerate's revenue still did not overshadow other divisions, but its strategic importance was immense because it represented the gateway to a future in which technology would become the backbone of Samsung's identity. The Suwon complex had become a symbol of that transformation, and the first screens produced on its lines had demonstrated that a country once known for its poverty could manufacture products that competed in a highly sophisticated sector. From here on, the challenge would no longer be simply to produce, but to turn those devices into a reference for millions of homes inside and outside Korea, something that would require a new effort in ambition, design, and international expansion. Conquering the living room of the world. At the beginning of the 1970s, when South Korea is going through a stage of accelerated industrialization and the cities are filling with factories, newly asphalted roads, and administrative buildings that seem to emerge out of nowhere, Samsung begins to feel that electronics is no longer an initial experiment, but a path of growth capable of changing the destiny of the conglomerate. The first production lines in Suwon have stabilized. Black and white televisions circulate in thousands of Korean homes, and the brand begins to awaken a particular sense of pride among those who see in it the proof that the country has made a real leap toward modernity. However, in the mind of Lee Byung-chul, there is an insistent concern that grows as he observes the international landscape. The Korean market is far too small to contain the kind of ambition he has for the company. If Samsung wants to occupy a relevant place in the world, it must push its way beyond its borders and bring its products to countries where the competition is fierce and the consumers have spent decades trusting foreign giants. At that moment, manufacturing a television good enough to sell in Korea is already a considerable challenge, but manufacturing one capable of competing in the United States or in Europe implies a completely different level of demand. It means mastering much stricter quality standards, adapting designs to varied tastes, understanding technical regulations, and responding to customers who do not forgive mistakes. Lee understands that entering that scenario is dangerous because a failure can cause enormous financial losses and damage the reputation of the company, but he also understands that staying within the local market, no matter how comfortable it may seem, would turn Samsung into a company dependent on its own country, a geopolitical and economic risk he is not willing to accept. Exporting, therefore, is not a tactical option, but a strategic necessity to guarantee the future of the conglomerate. The first step toward that opening materializes in 1978 with the creation of Samsung Electronics America, a subsidiary designed to study the United States market from within, participate in trade fairs, contact distributors, and understand the psychology of an audience accustomed to brands that had dominated the sector for decades. Establishing an office in the United States is, at that moment, a bold move, because the company is still learning to compete in its own country and resources are limited. Even so, Lee insists on creating physical presence outside Korea to accelerate the learning curve and avoid depending solely on intermediaries. For him, knowing a market from afar will never be enough. It is necessary to step into it, observe it, talk to its buyers, analyze their habits, and learn firsthand what a United States citizen expects when turning on a television or buying a household appliance. While this new subsidiary begins taking its first steps, industrial expansion within Korea continues its course. Samsung increases the production of televisions, introduces more refined models, and works on the development of devices that incorporate slightly more advanced technologies. Competition with Japanese companies is constant, because Japan dominates consumer electronics with an enormous advantage, and every Korean television that reaches the international market is examined under a microscope. This pressure forces Samsung to tighten its internal culture, reinforce quality controls, and study with enormous attention every innovation appearing in other countries. The factories become laboratories of discipline, where engineers supervise every detail, and the operators receive continuous training to avoid errors that could ruin an entire export batch. The company advances through sacrifice, occasional failures, and discrete victories that, little by little, position its name beyond Asia. Growth in consumer electronics is also fueled by progress in logistics and foreign trade. Samsung invests in developing its own distribution networks, negotiating agreements with maritime transport companies, and creating efficient systems to pack, label, and ship products across thousands of kilometers. This may seem like a minor aspect in the history of the group, but without reliable logistics, no company can aspire to be global. In this stage, Samsung learns that conquering the living room of an American, European, or Middle Eastern family is work that begins long before the television reaches a store. It begins in warehouses, on ships, in ports, in the obsessive care of every phase of transportation. This knowledge will be crucial decades later, when the company needs to move millions of mobile devices around the planet. During these years, the group also deepens its technological diversification. Although televisions remain the star product of the electronics division, Samsung begins manufacturing other devices for the home: refrigerators, washing machines, air conditioners, and basic audio equipment. Each new product line brings its own challenges, because mastering cold, water, sound, or airflow requires different knowledge, specific suppliers, and optimized designs. The conglomerate adapts to this complexity with an approach that is already part of its identity: testing, failing, correcting, perfecting. The company becomes a kind of industrial school where every mistake is a reminder that there is no shortcut to technical excellence. At the same time, the entrepreneurial spirit that characterized the commercial phase of Lee Byung-chul remains present, but adapted to the dimensions of a conglomerate that is now part of the economic fabric of the country. The founder becomes personally involved in product reviews, visits factories, demands detailed reports, and stays in direct contact with the heads of the new international subsidiaries. His leadership style, strict and focused on the long term, helps maintain internal cohesion in a stage where the company could have become scattered among so many different business lines. For Lee, growing rapidly does not mean growing in a disorganized way. Every expansion must be supported by infrastructure, talent, and solid processes. As Samsung's consumer electronics carve out a place in foreign markets, the governments of South Korea observe this progress with attention because it represents something more than business profits. It is proof that the country can compete in complex technological sectors and leave behind, definitively, the image of a poor and backward nation. The authorities support the conglomerate with policies that encourage exports, facilitate investment in machinery, and offer access to strategic credit. The growth of Samsung thus becomes a fundamental part of the National Economic Development Project, and this tacit alliance between the government and the Chaebol strengthens even more the position of the group within the industrial fabric of the country. Toward the end of the 1970s and the beginning of the 1980s, Samsung begins to see the fruits of all this accumulated effort. Its televisions reach more countries, its household appliances compete in price and reliability, and its name becomes increasingly associated with products that fulfill what they promise. Although the brand is still far from becoming a global reference, its presence becomes increasingly difficult to ignore in the global market. Most importantly, at this point, Samsung has developed an industrial, logistical, and organizational capacity that will allow it, in the following years, to make the leap into sectors that will transform the history of the group forever. And it is precisely in that terrain, while consumer electronics are conquering the living rooms of different continents, where a new ambition arises that will change the scale of the conglomerate. A bet as risky as it is decisive, destined to take Samsung into the very heart of the technological revolution. Chips, memory, and an obsession with winning. At the end of the 1970s, when Samsung televisions were beginning to make a place for themselves in homes in different countries, and the conglomerate could congratulate itself for having ceased to be exclusively a producer of basic goods and for having become a relevant actor in consumer electronics, in the offices of senior management, people spoke more and more about something that could not be seen in any display case, that did not shine in living rooms, and that nevertheless had the power to decide who would rule the technology industry in the following decades. Semiconductors, those small rectangles of silicon that stored and processed information, and that became the silent heart of any electronic device that aspired to be competitive. For many business leaders, that world of chips and ultra-clean factories sounded like distant science fiction. But for the top management of Samsung, it was beginning to feel like a strategic urgency. The logic that guided that leap was forceful, although dizzying. If the company manufactured televisions, audio equipment, and little by little other devices, depending on foreign suppliers for the most sensitive components, left it in a vulnerable position, like an army that buys its own weapons from potential rivals. Each imported integrated circuit was a reminder that, no matter how solid the consumer electronics business was, the true lever of power resided in whoever dominated the design and production of chips. The executives analyzed reports, studied the progress of Japanese and United States companies, observed the evolution of dynamic random access memory, the famous DRAM, and realized that entering that territory meant changing leagues, from the league of efficient assemblers to the league of the protagonists of the digital revolution. The problem was that semiconductors required an investment that far exceeded anything Samsung had undertaken until then, because setting up a chip factory did not resemble at all the construction of a television plant or a home appliance facility. Ultra-clean room environments were required, extremely expensive machinery, precise lithography processes, highly qualified engineers, and a culture of quality that did not allow frequent stumbles, since a small failure in the manufacturing environment could ruin entire silicon wafers valued at astronomical amounts. Many would have considered this economic and technical barrier as an insurmountable wall, but Lee Byung-chul saw in it a kind of natural filter. Only those who accepted paying that price would have the possibility of influencing the future of technology. In that context, Samsung's close relationship with the South Korean state again played a key role, because the government saw in semiconductors an opportunity to push the country toward the technological frontier, distancing it from the image of a simple producer of low-cost manufactured goods. Plans were designed, incentives were offered, roadmaps were drawn, in which the selected conglomerates, among them Samsung, appeared as central pieces of a project that sought to place South Korea on the world map of high technology. The bet was so ambitious that, if it went wrong, it could drag the companies involved into a financial hole from which it would be very difficult to emerge. But both the government and the group's top leadership were willing to take that risk in the name of a shared objective. In the first years of the decade of 1980, Samsung begins to build its foundations in the world of chips, focusing much of its efforts on DRAM memory, a type of product that, although it may seem simple from the outside, demands a deep command of circuit design, the manufacturing process, and the management of intensely volatile demand cycles. The company sends engineers abroad to learn in other factories, hires talent that has worked in leading companies, and becomes accustomed to investing enormous amounts in research and development, a field where results do not arrive immediately, and where the time between an error and its correction can cost millions. Each new technological node, each reduction in the size of transistors, requires redesigning entire processes, updating equipment, and retraining the entire organization. The real entry into the memory business comes accompanied by hard blows, because the semiconductor market is famous for its extreme cycles, years of high prices and skyrocketing demand, followed by periods of oversupply in which prices plunge and companies are forced to sell below production cost. Samsung experiences those brutal curves firsthand, finds itself trapped in moments when inventories accumulate, the accounts turn red, and the press and some analysts wonder whether it has gone too far in trying to compete with established giants. In those moments of doubt, the difference between a group that gives up and another that persists is defined by the conviction of its leadership. Lee Byung-chul and, little by little, the generation that begins to succeed him maintain the decision to move forward, even if that implies tightening the belt and assuming temporary losses. Inside the chip factories, the atmosphere is different from that of other plants in the conglomerate. Workers move with special suits. Dust particles become deadly enemies. Processes are monitored obsessively, and the general feeling is that people work in an environment where the margin of error is almost non-existent. That extreme demand shapes the internal culture of the semiconductor division, which positively contaminates the rest of the group, sending a very clear message. Reaching technological leadership requires a discipline that goes beyond what is customary, a way of working that turns precision into a rule, and improvisation into something dangerous. As Samsung improves its yields and reduces its defect rates, internal confidence grows, and with it, the ambition to climb positions in the world market. The moment when the bet begins to show visible results arrives at the beginning of the decade of 1990, when, after years of investments, adjustments, stumbles, and advances, Samsung manages to position itself as one of the main manufacturers of DRAM memory on the planet, to the point of disputing absolute leadership in this segment. That position not only ensures enormous income during boom periods, it also grants it a strategic advantage of the highest order. Its own electronic products can be fed by chips manufactured internally and other companies around the world. Some of them, competitors in other sectors, begin to depend on Samsung as an essential supplier of their devices. The conglomerate has ceased to be only a manufacturer of devices to become a critical provider of the components that allow those devices to exist. From the perspective of entrepreneurship, this stage is especially revealing, because it shows the extent to which a company can reinvent its identity when it is willing to embrace sectors that are intensive in capital and knowledge, instead of taking refuge in what it already dominates. Samsung's transition toward semiconductors is not explained solely by a technical decision, but by a mentality that assumes that true economic power lies in controlling the most complex and difficult-to-replicate pieces of the value chain. By placing itself at the center of the memory industry, the company not only earns money, it also earns influence, prestige, and a negotiating capacity that shields it from swings in other markets. At the same time, the internal life of the conglomerate begins to change. Success in chips creates a kind of emotional standard that permeates the entire organization, a feeling that it is no longer only about competing in price or volume, but about demonstrating, almost as a matter of national and corporate pride, that South Korea can lead the technological vanguard in a field where previously only names from the United States, Europe, or Japan were mentioned. That mixture of pride and pressure will translate, in the next stage, into a profound transformation of Samsung's own character, driven by a figure who will take the helm with the intention of shaking every corner of the company and demanding a level of excellence that goes far beyond production figures. The Cultural Revolution of Lee Kun-hee. In 1987, when Samsung was already a gigantic conglomerate with sugar factories, textile plants, household appliances, televisions, and, increasingly, memory chips that were beginning to give it recognition in the technological world, a silent but decisive turning point occurred: the death of Lee Byung-chul, the founder who had guided the group from that small trading house in Daegu to the heart of Korean industrialization. His passing was not only a generational change, it was the end of a way of understanding the company based on constant expansion and almost military discipline. And, at the same time, the opening of a new chapter in the hands of his son, Lee Kun-hee, who took command with a very clear feeling. If Samsung continued doing things as it had done until then, it ran the risk of becoming trapped in mediocrity, producing large volumes of products that people bought because of price, but rarely admired. The new chairman inherited an immense group, with dozens of subsidiaries and a growing presence in multiple sectors, although when he looked at that structure as a whole, he did not see a global champion. He saw a heavy, sometimes clumsy machine, designed to produce a lot, but struggling to stand out in an international market increasingly sensitive to quality, design, and brand value. While Japan imposed its technological prestige on the world, Europe showcased its engineering, and the United States dominated high-value-added segments. Samsung continued to drag an uncomfortable label. It was reliable for certain products, yes, but it still gave the impression of being a follower, a second-tier manufacturer filling gaps that others did not cover. That diagnosis, which any leader might have ignored out of fear of confronting internal inertia, became for Kun-hee a daily obsession. At the beginning of the 1990s, the new leader decided that it would not be enough to adjust processes or set more ambitious sales targets. He felt that the problem did not lie only in the factories or the engineering departments, but in the mentality of the entire organization, in a culture that had grown accustomed to the implicit motto of "make a lot and make it fast," even if quality and the user experience sometimes remained in the background. That perception crystallized in a scene that has become almost legendary in business history. In 1993, in a hotel in Frankfurt, Germany, he gathered his top executives and delivered a message that would echo throughout every office and plant of the group, a blunt sentence that resonated like a hammer striking a table. Everything must change except our wives and children. With that deliberate exaggeration, what he was truly saying was that the problem was so deep it could not be solved with small adjustments, that what was needed was a cultural revolution. From that moment on, Kun-hee launched an internal crusade focused on quality, design, and the construction of a respected global brand. Even if to achieve it he had to confront routines, executives who believed that their methods had already proved valid, factories proud of their production volume, and departmental cultures that operated like separate kingdoms. The new chairman visited plants, convened exhausting meetings, imposed ruthless audits and, above all, sent a message that reached the last worker. A defective product is not merely a faulty piece. It is a blow to the collective reputation, a stain that drags down the name of Samsung in every market where it competes. From that idea emerged scenes as radical as the one in which he ordered the public destruction of thousands of phones and devices deemed to be of poor quality, piling them up in the courtyard of a factory and setting them on fire in front of the workforce, a harsh image that was etched into the organization's consciousness as a visual reminder that the era of tolerance for massive failures had come to an end. This revolution was not limited to symbolic gestures. It translated into a profound reorganization of the group's structure. Many subsidiaries that had drifted into activities with little real synergy were reorganized. Some units were merged. Strategic divisions such as semiconductors and consumer electronics were reinforced, and a new expectation emerged. Each area had to contribute to a unified vision, not only to its own balance sheets. The criteria for evaluating executives changed. Promotions stopped depending solely on seniority or short-term results, and began to consider the ability to lead teams toward international quality standards. The message was clear. The company would not reward only those who sold the most, but those who were capable of creating products the group could be proud of in any country. In parallel, Kun-hee set an ambitious goal regarding brand positioning. He wanted Samsung to stop being perceived as an option of compromise and to become an aspirational alternative, something consumers chose out of desire and not only out of necessity. To achieve that, he strengthened industrial design departments, hired creative talent, promoted the opening of research and development centers in several countries, and placed special emphasis on ensuring that products were not only functional, but also aesthetically attractive, modern and consistent with a recognizable visual identity. Televisions began to refine their lines and interfaces. Household appliances paid attention to everyday usability details, and audio and video equipment were designed to integrate into increasingly sophisticated homes. Little by little, the brand began to be associated with modernity, instead of remaining trapped in the stereotype of a low-cost manufacturer. Another essential element of this cultural transformation was the internationalization of the managerial perspective. To break habits of thinking that were too local, Samsung sent its executives to live for periods in the United States, Europe, and Japan, literally forcing them to confront other management styles, to walk through stores where their products competed with those of historic brands, to listen to consumers who had no loyalty to Korea and who demanded value for every coin they spent. That exposure acted as a relentless mirror. Many directors, who in Seoul felt untouchable, discovered that outside their bubble, Samsung still had much to improve. Upon their return, some came back with a defensive attitude, but many others returned with a renewed determination to apply deep changes in their areas. Kun-hee's revolution also had a human cost that must be mentioned if we want to understand the complete story. Expectations rose sharply, pressure to meet the new standards was enormous, and some projects were cancelled or abruptly reoriented, generating internal tension, resistance, and, at times, exhaustion. However, over the years, the overall result of that process spoke for itself. Samsung's products began to climb in quality rankings, international design awards became frequent, and, above all, public perception shifted. People began to talk about the brand as a true competitor in segments where previously only Japanese or European names were mentioned. By the end of the 1990s, Samsung was no longer simply present in the living rooms of homes around the world. It was beginning to occupy a prominent place in them. Its high-end televisions, its video equipment, and its household appliances became symbols of modernity in many markets, and in parallel, its leadership in chip manufacturing reinforced the image of a company that not only sold visible devices, but also produced essential components of the global technological infrastructure. The cultural revolution of Kun-hee, with its mixture of extreme gestures, harsh restructuring, and long-term vision, had achieved what seemed impossible a decade earlier. Samsung had stopped being seen as a brand that chased others and had transformed itself into an actor that set the pace in several sectors, and almost without the general public realizing it, as that cultural transformation consolidated. The group's laboratories and development centers were already preparing the next steps, because the future of electronics was about to shift from the living room to the pocket, and the company that had learned to lead with televisions and household appliances would now have to prove that it could also do so with personal devices that would carry the word Galaxy engraved on their casing. The birth of the consumer electronics giant. When the decade of the 1990s began, the world was entering a new stage marked by globalization, by the arrival of personal computers in households, by the appearance of the first mobile phones in the hands of executives and business people, and Samsung reached that point in history with something many companies would envy: a massive industrial base, a very strong position in semiconductors, and an internal culture recently shaken by the revolution led by Kun-hee, who had made it clear that the goal was no longer to manufacture a lot, but to manufacture in a way that would make the brand inspire respect in every corner of the planet. From that moment on, the question guiding the company was easy to express, but very difficult to answer with actions. How does a conglomerate of Korean origin, still carrying the inferiority complex of a follower, become a global giant in consumer electronics capable of setting trends and competing in the top league of design and technology? The answer begins in the living room, that space where television, music, family entertainment, and, with time, connection to the rest of the world all come together. Samsung understood that if it wanted to win the battle of perception, it had to dominate that symbolic place, because what a person sees every day at the center of their living room shapes their idea of which brands are up to the level and which ones remain a step below. That is why the company placed a strong bet on televisions, first refining its tube models, improving image quality, reducing failures, making the design stop being a heavy block and begin to interact with home decoration, and later launching itself decisively into the new flat-screen technologies that were timidly emerging in the market, such as LCD and later high-definition models that would forever transform the experience of watching content at home. The leap to flat screens was neither automatic nor painless. It required massive investments in new factories, alliances with suppliers of glass and specialized materials, and a clear commitment to innovation in panels that, at first, were expensive to produce and had narrow margins, but represented the future of the sector. Samsung, driven by its experience in semiconductors and by its vision of becoming a leader, decided that it was worthwhile to bring that future forward instead of waiting for it, assuming that there would be years of difficulty in which it would have to balance its traditional business with the new technology being developed. With time, that move proved to be the right one. As prices fell and consumers began to adopt flat televisions en masse, the brand found itself prepared with a broad range and a production capacity that allowed it to supply both the domestic and the international market, placing itself among the first names in the minds of people looking to renew their living rooms. As televisions grew in importance, other product lines were developed in parallel to reinforce Samsung's presence as a reference for the modern home. The company improved its refrigerators, washing machines, microwave ovens, and air conditioning systems, paying increasing attention to aspects that previously seemed secondary. such as noise, energy consumption, or the small ergonomic details that make an everyday task a little less burdensome. This focus on the user experience fit perfectly with the vision that Kun-hee repeatedly emphasized to his executive team. Technology only makes sense if it improves people's daily lives in a concrete way, and design must be an ally in that process, not an ornament for catalogs. In this way, Samsung's consumer electronics grew as a coherent set of solutions for the home, not as a scattered collection of unrelated products. During those same years, personal computers and consumer computing began to gain importance, and the group did not want to remain outside that movement. It launched into manufacturing monitors, laptops, and some desktop computers, taking advantage of its dominance in screens and chips to offer competitive machines, especially in Asia and in specific segments of the global market. Samsung's laptops did not achieve at that time the aura of certain historic brands, but they helped reinforce the central idea of this era. The company was present in almost every relevant category of electronics, building a complete brand image that accompanied users throughout the day, from the moment they turned on the television to the moment they worked, communicated, or listened to music. In parallel, mobile phones began to appear as a new territory to explore, first as large devices designed mainly for professionals, with visible antennas and designs that now seem almost caricature-like, but that at the time represented pure futurism. Samsung entered this field with simple models focused on reliability and signal quality, learning directly from the market how to manage specific distribution networks, agreements with operators, and product cycles much faster than those typical of televisions or household appliances. At first, the company did not lead this segment and coexisted with dominant brands such as Nokia and Motorola, but the experience accumulated during these early years would be vital when, later on, the telephone stopped being a device for calls and became a true pocket-sized computer. The key that allowed Samsung to advance firmly across so many lines at the same time lay in its ability to leverage its vertically integrated structure, which in business terms means that many of the components needed for its products were manufactured within the group itself. The memory chips produced in its semiconductor plants ended up in its televisions, in its computers, and in devices from other brands. The screens it produced were installed in its own products, as well as sold to third parties, and that dual role of supplier and final manufacturer granted it a critical advantage over competitors fully dependent on external supplies. In a sector where costs, availability of components, and control of the value chain could sink or save a company, Samsung learned to navigate that balance in increasingly sophisticated ways. The global presence of the brand was consolidated through a strategy that combined ambitious marketing campaigns, visible sponsorships, and broad distribution in physical stores and electronics chains around the world. The company invested in associating its name with major sporting events, with concerts, with spaces where cameras focused on millions of people, understanding that in the collective imagination, the repeated appearance of a logo in aspirational contexts creates a sense of familiarity and prestige that later translates into trust at the moment of purchase. Seeing the word Samsung on a jersey, in a stadium, or on a giant screen was part of the plan to definitively abandon the image of a secondary brand and enter the league of names that people recall effortlessly when they think of technology. This phase of expansion in consumer electronics also implied a growing sophistication in the way products were designed for different markets. The company realized that what worked in Korea, or in other Asian countries, did not necessarily fit in the same way in Europe, the Middle East, or Latin America, and it began adapting details, styles, and functionalities to each region, listening more closely to local teams and market studies. In this way, a Samsung television or refrigerator in a particular country could incorporate features designed for the habits of that population, from the capacity of the freezer to the type of default settings in the menus, something that strengthened the sense of closeness with consumers. By the end of the 1990s and the beginning of the first years of the 21st century, the result of this accumulation of decisions was clearly visible. Samsung had become one of the reference brands in televisions. It competed on equal footing in household appliances, and it was making its way in computers and mobile phones, all of it supported by a solid industrial base and increasingly forceful leadership in semiconductors. The consumer electronics giant was now standing firmly, and every time someone turned on a screen or opened the door of an appliance with its logo, that subtle but constant presence in daily life grew stronger. However, While the living room and the home continued to be key territories, the world was beginning to move a central part of the digital experience into people's pockets. And in that emerging territory, which was taking shape through the first advanced mobile phones and the birth of smartphones, Samsung would have to prove that it could transfer all its industrial, design and brand strength into a category where the speed of change would be far more brutal than anything it had experienced up to that point. Open war in the smartphone era. As the calendar approaches 2007, Samsung is in an enviable position on almost every front of consumer electronics. Its televisions dominate rankings, its chips power devices across half the world, and its flip phones with physical keypads sell very well in multiple markets. However, beneath the surface of the industry, a shift begins to take shape, one that will completely alter the rules of the game, a wave that cares nothing for past success, and that will sweep away anyone unable to adapt quickly enough. That wave crystallizes in a moment that is now etched into the memory of the industry: the presentation of the first iPhone, a phone from a company that, until then, did not manufacture mobile devices, but that carries a different vision of what it means to have a device in one's pocket. It is no longer about calling and sending messages. It is about having a small touchscreen computer that organizes daily life, browses the internet, and consumes applications with the same natural ease with which people once turned on the television. In those days, Samsung is already working on more advanced phones. It experiments with resistive touchscreens, offers models running proprietary systems and Windows Mobile, and explores designs that combine physical keyboards and displays, all while maintaining a strong position against rivals such as Nokia, Motorola, and Sony Ericsson. Yet Apple's proposal introduces a more fluid user experience, a controlled software ecosystem, and a hardware-software integration that directly influences public perception. Many within the company know that the impact of this launch is not a passing trend. They sense that the phone, as it was known, is about to disappear, and that anyone who does not adapt to this new reality will see their devices pushed into an increasingly narrow segment of the market. In the years immediately following, Samsung's strategic response takes shape around a fundamental idea. It cannot continue experimenting with scattered systems. It needs a solid platform on which to build an entire family of smart devices. That element appears with the development of Android, Google's operating system, which promises an open environment compatible with multiple manufacturers, capable of growing through applications and constant updates, and presented as the clearest alternative to the iPhone's closed model. Samsung detects in Android the opportunity to align with a giant in software and the internet in order to compete on equal footing in the realm of intelligent experiences, and it begins working on devices that integrate this system with the advanced hardware the company already masters. In 2010, this commitment takes public form with the launch of the first generation of the Galaxy S, a phone that incorporates many of the lessons learned through years of iteration, offers a high-quality display, a refined design, and Samsung's own interpretation of what a modern smartphone should be. It becomes the first symbol of a new era for the brand in the mobile market. From that moment on, the word Galaxy transforms into an umbrella under which various models appear, from more accessible devices to true flagships that compete in the high-end segment with the terminals from Apple and other manufacturers. The strategy becomes extremely aggressive. Samsung decides to flood the market with offerings for nearly every price point and every carrier. The strength of this offensive relies not only on the variety of models, it also rests on the company's ability to exploit its vertical integration by using high-quality displays, memory, processors, and other components manufactured in its own facilities. This allows it to control costs, launch products with powerful specifications, and react quickly to shifts in demand. While other manufacturers must negotiate every component batch with third parties, Samsung is, in many cases, negotiating with itself, balancing the interests of its different divisions but always able to prioritize smartphones during key moments. This advantage, which had already served the company well in the world of televisions and appliances, becomes a decisive weapon in an industry where product cycles accelerate to levels unknown in earlier generations of electronic devices. As the Galaxy lineup spreads across the world, the war for smartphone dominance intensifies on several fronts at once. On one side is the purely technological competition, the race to offer sharper displays, more capable cameras, longer-lasting batteries, lighter designs, and features that stand out in marketing campaigns, such as stylus support, advanced photography modes, or customized layers on top of Android that distinguish the user experience. On another front lies the battle of perception, the struggle to associate your brand with innovation, style, and prestige, something Samsung fuels through massive advertising campaigns, sponsorships, carrier partnerships, and spectacular launch events where new models are presented almost as ceremonial moments. Parallel to these commercial and technological efforts, a particularly delicate front opens, the legal one. Apple accuses Samsung of copying design elements and functionalities of the iPhone, and these accusations lead to a series of patent and intellectual property lawsuits in different countries. Highly publicized trials follow, with comparisons of icons, edges, touch gestures, and specific interface features. In some cases, the courts side with Apple and force Samsung to pay multi-million-dollar damages. In others, the decisions are nuanced or favorable to the Korean group. But beyond the specific outcomes, what becomes clear is that the smartphone war is no longer fought only in stores or technology fairs. It is also fought in law offices and courtrooms. Far from demoralizing the company, these legal battles reinforce an internal conviction. If Samsung wants to continue growing in this territory, it must deepen its commitment to its own design, to its own visual and functional personality, distancing itself from any shadow of imitation and building an identity recognizable at first glance. This becomes evident through successive generations of phones, incorporating distinct curves in their displays, interfaces aligned with the brand's own aesthetic, characteristic software elements, and increasing integration with other Samsung devices such as smartwatches, tablets, and televisions. The idea is clear. The phone is not an isolated product. It is the main entry point into an ecosystem. During the explosive years of the smartphone boom, Samsung reaches the #1 position in global sales, achieving market shares that in some quarters are overwhelming, something that reflects the effectiveness of its strategy to occupy every price segment, collaborate with carriers in aggressive promotions, and launch campaigns that present the Galaxy phones as symbols of modernity and technological power. However, this leading position brings constant pressure, because alongside the direct competition with Apple arises a new challenge. Chinese manufacturers that begin offering devices with good features at very competitive prices, pushing Samsung to continue differentiating itself in the high-end segment and to carefully consider its presence in lower-priced categories. Internally, the smartphone war also redefines priorities and work rhythms. Innovation cycles shorten. Each year, a new flagship generation is expected, with significant improvements and coordination among engineering, design, marketing, and supply chains must function almost like clockwork. Any failure in that machinery can cause delays, reputational damage, or more serious problems. This environment of maximum speed drives the company to develop increasingly sophisticated working methods, but also exposes it to greater risks, because the margin for error in such complex products is small, and any flaw is amplified in the hands of millions of users within a very short time. By the end of this stage, what began as a reaction to the arrival of the iPhone has become a complete transformation of Samsung's public identity. The brand is no longer seen merely as a maker of large televisions or reliable appliances. It is now one of the central players in mobile computing, a company capable of influencing the way hundreds of millions of people communicate, work, entertain themselves, and manage their daily lives through a screen that fits in the palm of a hand. However, the road to that leadership has not been free of stumbles, and in the years ahead, the company will be forced to face painful mistakes and unexpected crises that will test the strength of everything it has built in the smartphone era. Falls, recalls, and resilience. When Samsung enters the second half of the decade of 2010, the success of the Galaxy line seems to have consolidated firm ground under the feet of the Korean giant. Sales grow in numerous markets. The brand is perceived as a synonym for rapid and accessible innovation, and consumers eagerly await each annual presentation to discover which new functions, cameras, or technical advances will arrive in their phones. In this climate of confidence, the company designs increasingly ambitious products, convinced that the only way to stay on top in such a competitive sector is to take calculated risks and embrace technologies that are still in a stage of maturity. However, on that path toward complete sophistication, the company unknowingly approaches the episode that will strike its reputation the most in the entire modern era of smartphones. In 2016, Samsung presents the Galaxy Note 7, a device that symbolizes everything the brand wants to represent at that moment. Power, refined design, a curved screen that sets trends, a stylus integrated into an elegant body, and performance that competes directly with the best on the market. The initial reception is enthusiastic. Reviews consider it one of the most complete phones of the year, and during the first weeks, it seems that the company has managed to fit together all the pieces of engineering and design in a device that projects maturity and technical mastery. However, that feeling does not last long, because in different parts of the world, reports begin to circulate of units that heat up excessively, deform, and in the most serious cases, catch fire or explode during charging or daily use. At first, at Samsung's headquarters, it is believed that these are isolated incidents, problems associated with a small batch of batteries from a specific supplier. The company begins an accelerated internal investigation, reviews every detail of the production process, and launches a first withdrawal of devices that seeks to correct the defect without completely stopping the product cycle. New phones are delivered to affected users, specific support lines are established, and the company tries to transmit calm. For a few days, the strategy seems to work, but soon, new reports begin to arrive, this time associated with replacement units. That detail is what forces the company to admit that the problem is not punctual, but structural, and that it extends beyond a simple defective batch. When the incidents multiply and images of damaged phones appear in international media, Samsung faces an unprecedented situation. It is forced to order a global withdrawal of the Galaxy Note 7, an extremely costly move from an economic point of view and devastating from a reputational perspective. No technology company wants to be in the position of announcing that one of its flagship products must be returned in its entirety, but Samsung understands that, in the face of a threat that affects user safety, there is no room for indecision. The company stops production, publicly asks all owners to turn off their devices, coordinates an unprecedented return process, and assumes the multi-million-dollar loss that implies renouncing a product in which it had placed enormous expectations. The subsequent investigation reveals the complexity of the problem. An extremely tight design, with minimal tolerances. Press the battery under certain conditions, which could cause internal short circuits. That level of technical detail, which in documents appears described with coldness, is in reality a reminder of how difficult it is to work in a sector where every millimeter counts, where each advance requires pushing the limits of design, and where a small error in a component invisible to the user can destroy credibility built over years. In Samsung's corporate culture, marked by an obsession with excellence and speed in development, the moral blow of the Note 7 case is profound. The company faces an essential dilemma: stop to review its entire control system, or continue forward as if it were a temporary crisis. The answer, aligned with the philosophy that Kun-hee had planted decades earlier, consists of looking inward with unusual severity. Independent committees are formed, safety protocols are redesigned, testing phases are intensified, tolerance margins are expanded, and new batteries are developed under stricter standards, all accompanied by transparent communication that seeks to regain the trust of a public observing the process with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. Internally, the episode triggers a kind of emotional cleansing. Engineering teams review their processes in more detail than ever. Executives push exhaustive meetings to identify any organizational failure, and the way different divisions must collaborate is redefined to ensure that a product passes through enough layers of validation before reaching the market. What had been a culture characterized by speed transforms into a more complex balance in which precision weighs as much as the ability to innovate. In a way, the Note 7 case forces Samsung to mature again, just as it had done in the 1990s when quality became the company's guiding light. Meanwhile, the competition watches the episode closely. Apple takes advantage of the situation to reinforce its message of stability and control in its value chain. And emerging Chinese manufacturers see an opportunity to gain ground in markets where Samsung had been dominant. In that scenario, the company must demonstrate that it is not fatally wounded and that its recovery capacity is real. The launch of the Galaxy S, 8 months later, thus becomes a decisive test, a public exam in which millions of people observe whether the brand is capable of delivering an impeccable product, and it succeeds. The S8 receives praise for its design, its immersive screen, and its reliability, which marks the beginning of a recovery that does not erase the past but shows that the company knows how to rise after hitting bottom. The impact of the Note 7 case is not limited to the technical sphere. It also affects Samsung's strategic positioning, which begins to pay more attention to the global perception of safety, to the importance of explaining its processes, and to the need to avoid excessive haste in launches that can compromise its brand. The crisis leaves a trace that is noticeable in the following years. The company communicates its quality tests with greater precision, insists on its advances in batteries, and bets on diversifying its high-end offer with devices that seek to stand out for their robustness and design without sacrificing safety margins. Over time, the Note 7 case becomes a permanent reminder within the organization, a kind of scar that, far from weakening, strengthens the internal culture. Each new smartphone goes through a more rigorous process. Each technical decision is analyzed with greater calm, and the relationship with users is handled with renewed sensitivity. The reputation, damaged but still standing, is rebuilt with discipline and with a sequence of products that demonstrate that innovation is not incompatible with prudence. And as that reconstruction process advances, ideas arise in Samsung's laboratories that will once again change the course of the mobile industry. Ideas that seek to challenge the very shape of the phone, and that become the next chapter in a story where ambition and boldness continue to push the limits of design and technology. Power, politics, and scandals of the Lee family. As Galaxy phones multiply in the pockets of half the planet, and Samsung reinforces its image as a symbol of everyday technology, at the top of the conglomerate, another story is unfolding, far less visible to the average user, but absolutely essential to understand the direction of the company. The relationship between the Lee family, Korean political power, and the scandals that will eventually place its heir on the defendant's bench. It is as if Samsung were living in two parallel realities, one made of bright screens and spectacular launches, and another made of offices, trials, uncomfortable headlines and battles to maintain control of an empire that moves a significant portion of the economy of South Korea. When the health of Lee Kun-hee begins to deteriorate seriously from the year 2014 onward, after years of leading the cultural transformation and global rise of Samsung, attention naturally shifts to his son, Lee Jae-yong, known in many international media outlets as J.Y. Lee. He represents the third generation, in charge of the conglomerate, and for a long time he has played secondary roles, preparing in silence, learning the internal mechanics of a group that is not simply a company but a complex system of subsidiaries, cross-shareholdings and delicate balances with banks, investors and state authorities. As the patriarch withdraws from the scene for health reasons, the heir begins to appear in the foreground as vice president of Samsung Electronics and the de facto leader of the group. The transition is not a transparent process like the one expected in a publicly traded Western corporation. It is filled with nuances characteristic of the Chaebol model, where the controlling family seeks to reinforce its position through corporate maneuvers that often raise suspicions among minority shareholders and regulators. One of the key moments in this story is the merger, in the year 2015, of Samsung C&T with Chaebol Industries, a complex operation that restructures shareholdings and helps consolidate the Lee family's power over the conglomerate. For critical observers, that merger is interpreted as a surgical move to secure the generational transfer of power, using corporate structures that, although legal, fuel the debate about transparency and fairness toward smaller shareholders. As these movements take place, South Korea enters a period of high political tension, with a presidency increasingly questioned and a growing sense that the relationship between economic power and political power has become too close. In that context, the scandal that shakes the country explodes. The case of President Park Kun-hee and her friend and advisor Choi Soon-sil, accused of exerting improper influence, pressuring companies to finance foundations and favoring certain interests in exchange for political support. The investigation of this scheme, which fills front pages and leads to massive demonstrations in the streets, ends up directly affecting Samsung because prosecutors accuse the company of having participated in that exchange of favors, channeling funds toward entities linked to Choi, in exchange for government support for the controversial merger of the year 2015. The name of Lee Jae-yong then appears, not as the brilliant executive who leads a company admired around the world, but as the alleged protagonist of a very high-level corruption case. The image of this heir, accustomed to moving in international summits and meetings with other business leaders, being questioned, detained, and eventually tried, has an enormous symbolic impact on Korean society, because it materializes something that for decades had been debated. To what extent Chaebols are subject to the law in the same way as any other citizen, or whether their size and economic importance grant them a kind of informal shield. In the year 2017, after a process followed closely by the entire country, Lee Jae-yong is found guilty of several charges related to bribery and corruption and is sentenced to prison. For Samsung, beyond the legal implications, the blow is extremely severe in terms of internal and external reputation, because the figure meant to guarantee the continuity of the group is deprived of freedom, and the conglomerate is forced to demonstrate that it can continue functioning without its de facto leader at the helm. The management teams rely on the company's professionalized structure, supported by committees and veteran executives, who keep projects moving and manage technological launches without the public noticing a clear slowdown. But in the hallways and power circles of Seoul, the feeling is that an era is in doubt. Lee's time in prison is not linear. It is marked by appeals, reviews, and judicial changes in criteria, reflecting the deep tensions of a society that looks harshly upon the excesses of its elites, but is also aware of the role companies like Samsung play in its economy, in employment, and in the international projection of the country. During this period, intense debates arise about whether imprisoned business leaders should receive leniency, with arguments ranging from the need for exemplary punishment to fears that excessively harsh decisions might weaken national competitiveness. In the midst of all this, Lee Jae-yong adopts a more humble public tone, promising changes in the group's governance and implicitly acknowledging that the old model of power concentrated in a single family must adapt to the transparency expectations of the 21st century. In parallel to these legal processes, Samsung continues advancing in its key activities. The semiconductor division reaches new milestones in manufacturing capacity. The consumer electronics division maintains its leadership position, and Galaxy smartphones continue to dominate the market, demonstrating the extent to which the operational structure of the group is designed to withstand, even when the leadership faces legal and media earthquakes. This ability to keep moving forward amid the noise is, from the perspective of entrepreneurship, a lesson about the importance of building systems that do not depend solely on one person, no matter how influential that person may be. Over time, some of the most serious judicial processes end in reviews, partial acquittals, or closures, and the legal framework surrounding Lee Jae-yong gradually clears, allowing him to progressively resume his role as the visible leader of the conglomerate, although under a much more watchful public eye and with far greater international scrutiny. The message that remains floating is twofold. On one hand, justice has shown that it can touch the elites, and on the other, economic reality has reminded everyone that companies like Samsung remain fundamental pieces of the country's structure, to the point that their future and the future of South Korea are deeply intertwined. The sum of these episodes of power, politics, and scandal reveals a less glamorous but very real facet of Samsung's history. Behind each announcement of a new phone or a state-of-the-art chip factory, there are battles for control, negotiations with governments, pressure from shareholders, and decisions not always made in calm conditions. For those who view the story from the perspective of entrepreneurship, this part of the narrative serves as a reminder that the bigger a company becomes, the more complex its relationship with the institutional environment grows, and the more important it is to build governance structures capable of withstanding both economic ambition and social scrutiny. And while the Lee family deals with its own story of rises, falls, and returns, the giant they founded continues moving toward the future, seeking new ways to surprise the market with products that change the way we live and work, like those devices that challenge the traditional idea of what a phone is and open a new stage in Samsung's long relationship with innovation. Foldables. Bending the screen, not the company. When the smartphone market begins to show signs of saturation, with dozens of brands offering very similar screens, increasingly uniform designs, and cameras that compete to add megapixels as if they were points on an endless scoreboard, in the laboratories of Samsung there is a curious mix of pride and concern. because on one hand, the company leads the Android segment in many regions and can boast a consolidated Galaxy line, but on the other hand, the engineers and strategists feel that the risk of falling into monotony is real, that the phone runs the danger of becoming such a mature product that it only allows incremental improvements, small variations year after year that no longer spark public amazement. In that climate, an idea appears on the table, one that had been floating around for years in prototypes, patents, and experiments, making the screen bend without breaking, turning the phone into an object capable of changing shape depending on what the user needs at each moment. Flexible screen technology, based on OLED panels capable of curving, had been quietly developing inside the company for a long time, first in the form of conceptual demonstrations, closer to a technological fair spectacle than to a product ready for everyday life. But as engineering advances, the dream of a foldable phone begins to take shape. The challenge is not limited to making the screen withstand bending. It involves designing durable hinges, materials capable of enduring thousands of opening cycles, protective layers that replace traditional glass, and a software interface able to adapt to different sizes and orientations without transmitting a sensation of improvisation. Each of those elements requires specific teams, exhausting tests, and an enormous investment. And even then, no one can guarantee that the market will embrace the idea. Despite the doubts, the culture of Samsung has engraved in stone that the projects that change the course of an industry never emerge from comfort. So the company decides to take the step that many observers describe as reckless, launching a commercial foldable phone, a real device that people can buy, use, and carry in their pocket, and not a simple laboratory prototype for exhibition. The first Galaxy Fold appears as a kind of hybrid creature, with a format that combines the familiar and the strange, because when closed it resembles an elongated mobile, and when opened, it becomes something close to a small tablet. The implicit message is very clear. Samsung wants to demonstrate that the rigid rectangle of a lifetime is not the last word in smartphone design. The launch, however, reveals the price of being at the forefront of the vanguard. Some early units sent to the press present serious screen problems, with protective layers that some users remove, believing them to be simple plastics, failure points at the edges, and particles slipping into sensitive areas of the hinge. Images of damaged panels spread like wildfire on the internet. Headlines question the maturity of the product, and many wonder whether the company rushed too much in trying to be the first to reach the market. Samsung is forced to delay the commercial release, reinforce the design, explain in detail how the device should be handled, and revise communication and packaging to avoid confusion. It is a hard blow, especially after the trauma of the Galaxy Note 7, because it reminds the public that radical innovation can bring unexpected problems. The interesting thing is that, instead of abandoning the idea or hiding it in a drawer for years, the company decides to double down on its bet, convinced that foldables represent a new territory where no one yet has guaranteed leadership. After the corrections, the Galaxy Fold finally reaches the hands of the first buyers. And although the initial sales cannot be compared with the massive figures of traditional phones, the product fulfills a function that goes beyond volume. It acts as a showcase of the future, as a declaration of intent, as a sign that Samsung is willing to risk its reputation to maintain its position as a brand that dares to cross technological borders. While the Fold models mark this path in the most experimental segment, the company presents a second foldable line that fits better with the taste of the general public. The Galaxy Z Flip, a mobile that brings back the nostalgic gesture of flip phones, but reinterpreted with a flexible screen that opens and closes like a small technological mirror. The Flip appeals to a type of user who is not as interested in the tablet format, but who does value the combination of compact design, careful aesthetics, and a differentiated day-to-day experience. Suddenly, in cafes and on social networks, videos begin to appear showing people closing the phone with a smooth hand movement, enjoying that small ritual that seemed to have disappeared in the era of rigid rectangular blocks. Each generation of Fold and Flip incorporates improvements that are not always spectacular in headlines, but are decisive for those who use these devices intensively. Better protected internal screens, more robust and discreet hinges, lighter bodies, water resistance, a visibly reduced central crease, optimized batteries, and software that learns to better take advantage of the foldable format for multitasking, photography, or content consumption. In parallel, the Android ecosystem adapts, application developers adjust interfaces to different opening modes, and Samsung itself works on functions that make use of positioning the device half-folded, for example to use it as an integrated tripod or as a small desktop screen. From the business perspective, foldables have a very particular strategic role. Although they represent a relatively small percentage of total smartphone sales, their average value per unit is high, which helps maintain profitability in the premium range at a time when many users extend the life of their traditional phones. In addition, they offer the brand a space for differentiation compared to competitors focused on more conventional devices, and they reinforce the idea that Samsung is willing to experiment with formats that move away from market uniformity. In a sector where similar technical sheets abound, the shape of the device becomes an argument as important as the processor or camera numbers. Not everything is celebration, of course. Foldables continue to be the subject of scrutiny. Some users express doubts about their long-term durability, about possible wear in the crease area, about the high cost compared to traditional phones of similar power. The company listens to these criticisms and attempts to respond with more years of warranty in certain parts, campaigns that explain the manufacturing process more clearly, and constant work to reduce prices as the technology becomes standardized. That ability to combine the shine of marketing with the humility of continuous technical improvement is key for foldables to go from being a niche curiosity to a stable product in the catalog. As the years pass, as successive generations of fold and flip appear, the narrative changes its tone. What began as an experiment becomes a product line that evolves with a regularity similar to that of traditional flagships, and analysts begin to see foldables as an indicator of the brand's technological health. Each innovation in hinges, materials, or software integration is interpreted as a sign of Samsung's ability to continue leading the development of the next phase of mobile telephony. The fact that other companies, including historical rivals and emerging Chinese manufacturers, launch their own foldables, confirms that the concept has surpassed the curiosity phase and has settled as a recognized category within the industry. In symbolic terms, foldables represent something very powerful for the history of Samsung. They condense in one object the company's obsession with taking control of the screen, from those black and white televisions to the most advanced panels, including monitors, laptops, and mobiles. The screen is no longer just a window to content. It becomes a flexible, adaptable element that changes size and shape depending on the context, and Samsung wants to be the one who controls that transition both in hardware and in the supply of panels to other brands. At the end of this chapter, when you look at the evolution of the fold and flip models and think about the many times they were described as whims, products too fragile, or tools for a reduced audience, it becomes clear that, even with their risks, they have played the role of opening a new path in a sector that seemed doomed to repeat the same formula over and over again. And while the phones fold and adapt to the user's hand, in the invisible underground of this entire revolution, something less flashy but absolutely crucial continues to beat. The chip factories, the memory plants, and the centers where the brains that give life to each one of these devices are designed, and that will mark the next stretch of Samsung's history in the full era of artificial intelligence. The invisible brain. The age of AI. While foldables dominate headlines, unboxing videos overflow with displays that bend, and marketing campaigns turn Galaxy devices into would-be cultural icons, the true backbone of Samsung's power continues to operate far away from the spotlight, in places where one must wear a special suit to enter, where the air is filtered to obsessive levels, and where a single grain of dust can ruin weeks of work. It is in those semiconductor factories, in those clean rooms that look as if they were taken from a science fiction film, where Samsung forges the metal that supports the digital era and, increasingly, the age of artificial intelligence. Because at the end of every speech about algorithms, massive datasets, and advanced models lies the same physical truth. Without chips, there is no such thing as artificial intelligence. For years, Samsung's semiconductor story revolved around memory, those DRAM modules and flash chips that were stacked inside computers, consoles, phones, and servers, a kind of digital oil that powered the entire connected economy. With the rise of modern artificial intelligence, that importance multiplies, because training enormous models requires quantities of data and operations that would have been unimaginable a few decades earlier, and all that effort demands chips capable of moving information at enormous speeds, with controlled energy consumption and a reliability that ensures entire server farms can run day and night without failing. Suddenly, memory stops being just another component and becomes a critical bottleneck, and Samsung sees an opportunity that aligns perfectly with what it has been doing better than almost anyone for decades. In parallel with this evolution in memory, the group decides to strengthen its commitment to the contract manufacturing business, what the semiconductor world calls foundry, producing chips designed by others, whether they are major technology companies or firms specializing in processor, graphics card, and AI-specific hardware designs. In that league, Samsung faces rivals such as TSMC, companies that compete node by node, attempting to shrink transistor sizes to scales so small they begin to defy intuition. Each leap to a new generation requires investments measured in tens of billions, enormous risks in early production yields, and a constant race against the limits of physics. Samsung plunges into that game, combining its role as a supplier with its own need for chips, for phones, televisions, and data centers. What is fascinating about this stage is how artificial intelligence acts as an accelerator inside an industry that already moved fast. The major data centers that train models and serve millions of users depend on processors, specialized computing units, and, above all, high-bandwidth memory capable of feeding those silicon beasts without leaving them waiting for data. In that context, technologies such as HBM memory that stacks multiple layers of chips and connects them with ultra-fast interfaces become protagonists, and Samsung pours colossal energy into perfecting them, preparing dedicated production lines, isolating engineering teams, and negotiating contracts with companies developing hardware for artificial intelligence and seeking reliable partners to fulfill their own promises. Every time a company announces a new chip designed to train larger models or to run artificial intelligence in the cloud, there is a very real possibility that inside that product lies memory manufactured by Samsung, working silently so that neural networks can process images, text, voice, or video. It is a curious irony. While the general public associates artificial intelligence with flashy interfaces and eye-catching applications, the Korean conglomerate participates in the revolution from deep within the value chain, providing the temporary storage capacity that allows all that computation to occur at an acceptable pace. This role is not free of difficulties. The same cyclicality that affected semiconductors in previous decades grows even more severe during this period, because the demand for memory and advanced nodes for artificial intelligence can skyrocket within a few months and then stabilize or even fall if the economic cycle cools or if a customer delays projects. Samsung must learn to adjust its capacity, to calibrate investments in new factories in Korea, the United States, or other regions, and to negotiate incentives with governments seeking to attract production of strategic chips to their territory. Every decision to build a new plant involves betting on a horizon of many years, with the confidence that the demand for artificial intelligence will not be a temporary trend but a structural transformation of the economy. At the same time, within the group grows the awareness that artificial intelligence is not only an external business, a product for third parties, but something that can and should be integrated into the way Samsung designs and manufactures its own devices. Semiconductor teams work side by side with mobile, television, appliance, and enterprise solutions divisions to develop neural processing units, those small sections inside a chip that specialize in executing deep learning algorithms efficiently. This integration of capabilities allows functions such as image recognition, real-time translation, and computational photography enhancements to occur directly on the device, without sending all data to the cloud, something that improves response speed and, at the same time, protects user privacy. As artificial intelligence gains prominence in public conversation, Samsung begins to articulate a narrative in which it presents itself as a key actor across the entire chain, from fundamental hardware to the final experiences in users' hands. In industry conferences and company events, executives explain how the high-speed memory chips and computing platforms that leave their factories are helping build specialized data centers, and how those same technologies translate into phones and consumer devices capable of performing tasks that only a few years earlier seemed reserved for supercomputers. The narrative, at its core, is a way of reminding the market that the company is not only a visible brand, it is also an essential supplier, sustaining many other players in the artificial intelligence revolution. On the competitive front, the battle for advanced nodes becomes especially intense. Samsung strives to demonstrate that its manufacturing processes at extremely small nanometer scales can deliver yields on par with the best, and it submits itself to the scrutiny of customers who compare every technical detail before deciding where to order their next chips. There are moments when some rivals appear to have an edge, particularly in certain nodes, and the company receives criticism for failing to reach expected performance levels within planned timelines, forcing it to double down on research and development, to recruit specialized talent, and to rethink its roadmap to avoid falling behind in a field where the difference between leading and being in the second row translates into billions in contracts. For those observing this story from the outside, the lesson is clear. The power of a global technology company is shaped as much by what is seen as by what is unseen, and Samsung has understood for decades that controlling the invisible brain of devices, the chips no one looks at but upon which everything depends, is one of the keys to influencing the direction of the industry. In the age of artificial intelligence, this idea takes on a new dimension, because every advance in larger models or smarter services increases the importance of having a reliable supply of advanced memory and manufacturing capacity. Meanwhile, and almost in parallel, the consumer product divisions begin absorbing these advances in tangible ways, incorporating artificial intelligence functions into phones, watches, televisions, and other devices that become the visible face of all that invisible effort inside the chip factories, preparing the ground for an ecosystem in which the Galaxy brand stops being only a synonym for powerful hardware and becomes associated with intelligent experiences woven atop the silent muscle of semiconductors. Galaxy ecosystem. In recent years, when it already seemed that the mobile market had reached a kind of plateau in which almost all phones looked too similar and the differences were reduced to small details of camera or design, Samsung began to look at its catalog from another perspective, ceasing to think in terms of isolated products and starting to see a kind of constellation around a single word, Galaxy, which no longer referred only to the main smartphone, but to an entire universe of devices that range from the watch on the wrist to the television in the living room, passing through earphones, tablets, laptops, and connected appliances that inhabit the home. The underlying idea is simple to describe and complex to execute, that your digital life does not rest on scattered devices, but on an ecosystem in which everything speaks to everything else, and in which the user feels that they enter Samsung's home through one device and stay because everything else fits around it. That ecosystem is built around the phone, because it remains the center of gravity of digital life, the object you carry from the moment you wake up until the moment you go to bed, the one that wakes up with you with the alarm and falls asleep on the nightstand. But around it, orbit pieces that shape a much more fluid experience. Galaxy Watch devices count steps, measure heart rate, monitor sleep, and serve as a pocket remote control to answer calls, manage music, or receive notifications without taking the phone out of your pocket. Galaxy Tab tablets become screens for entertainment and work, synchronizing tabs, notes, and content with the phone, without the user having to think about it. Laptops with integration in the ecosystem allow dragging files, copying and pasting text between devices, and responding to messages from the physical keyboard when you are in front of the large screen. In the home, this logic extends to smart televisions and connected appliances. The television pairs with the phone to mirror the screen, show videos recorded a few minutes earlier, or receive notifications when a delivery arrives or a wash cycle ends. The smart refrigerator displays shopping lists, recipes, and warnings that synchronize with applications on the phone. The air conditioner or washing machine can be started, paused, or programmed from a central application, SmartThings, which acts as the orchestrator of the entire connected home. What at first seems like a set of charming functions acquires another dimension when seen as a whole. Samsung tries to ensure that the Galaxy brand is not only the name of a phone, but becomes a kind of technological surname that accompanies the user in almost any everyday activity. As hardware stabilizes, the company understands that the next qualitative leap will not come so much from adding more pixels or more gigahertz as from introducing a layer of intelligence that crosses the entire ecosystem, a kind of distributed brain that understands context, learns habits, and helps the user make decisions or perform tasks without having to fight with endless menus. This layer is articulated under the umbrella of artificial intelligence, and Samsung begins to integrate it at different levels, from very visible functions to discrete capabilities that work in the background to optimize energy, improve photographs, or adapt the television's sound to the acoustics of the room. On phones, artificial intelligence becomes a constant companion. The cameras use advanced models to interpret scenes, adjust colors, reduce noise in low-light conditions, and apply effects that previously required complex editing programs. The keyboard suggests words and entire phrases based on context. Note applications can summarize meetings, organize ideas, and generate outlines from long texts. And translation tools help maintain conversations with people who speak other languages through subtitles, transcriptions, and synthetic voice. A portion of these functions runs directly on the device, thanks to the specialized chips mentioned earlier, which allows them to continue functioning even if the internet connection fails and prevents the most sensitive data from having to leave the phone. In parallel, the company works hand in hand with major players in the world of software and cloud computing to leverage generative artificial intelligence models that reside in data centers and allow heavier tasks, such as modifying photographs, generating content, or performing complex translations in real time. This collaboration is designed so that the user feels continuity, perceiving no rigid boundary between what the device does and what the cloud does, but rather an experience in which intelligence is presented as an integrated service that lives both in the pocket and in remote infrastructures. The challenge, from Samsung's point of view, is to maintain a distinct identity in a field where many speak of artificial intelligence, differentiating its approach through integration with hardware and insistence on privacy and user control. In the realm of watches and other wearables, artificial intelligence focuses on health and wellness, interpreting data that goes far beyond simple step counting. Sleep patterns are analyzed, heart rate variations, stress levels estimated from pulse variability and breathing, and personalized advice is offered that seeks to fit into the person's real life, not an idealized version. The watch communicates with the phone to display more complete reports, with the television or tablet to offer guided exercise routines, and with third-party applications that transform this data into training plans, medical tracking, or simply daily motivation. What was once an accessory becomes a central piece in the relationship between the user and their own body. At home, the layer of intelligence also intensifies. The centralized home automation system learns to recognize usage patterns, adapts lighting, climate control, and operation of appliances to save energy or improve comfort, and enables scenarios in which a simple voice command or a programmed automation adjusts multiple devices at once, from closing blinds to playing music on a connected speaker. The television becomes a control panel that shows the status of cameras, sensors, or devices in different rooms, and the sense of unity is reinforced. It is no longer about having many devices from the same brand. It is about living in an environment in which technology coordinates itself to interfere as little as possible and solve tasks silently. From a business perspective, this ecosystem strategy has a very clear interpretation. A user who enters through one device and ends up trusting how it fits with the rest is more likely to stay, to renew their phone within the same family, to consider a Galaxy Watch when they need a wearable, to look first at Samsung televisions when they want to change the living room screen, to download the connected home application when they install a new washing machine. Each product ceases to be an isolated sale and becomes a link in a long-term relationship, and artificial intelligence functions as the glue that justifies that continuity, because the more connected everything is, the more sense it makes to remain within the same universe. This ambition to build an ecosystem with its own brain places Samsung in a peculiar position within the global technological landscape, because it coexists with software giants that dominate platforms such as Android or cloud services, with manufacturers that have opted for very closed integration between devices and systems, and with new players who try to position themselves in specific niches. The Korean company responds by relying on what has defined it since its industrial origins: the ability to manufacture, scale, and distribute hardware on a massive scale, now accompanied by an increasing effort to offer services, continuous updates, and intelligent functions that give the sensation of buying something alive, in evolution, and not an object doomed to become obsolete in a few years. When looking at this moment in Samsung's history, with phones, watches, televisions, and appliances, intertwined by an invisible network of data and algorithms, it becomes inevitable to think of that small shop in Daegu that sold noodles and dried fish, and of how far that initial impulse to seize every opportunity to go one step further has come. And it is precisely that historical perspective, that awareness of all the ground covered, that opens the door to a final reflection on what it means for a company like this to become part of our daily life, on the cost and impact of building a technological empire capable of accompanying us from the moment the alarm sounds at night until the moment we turn off the screen before sleeping. From the noodle shop to the global myth, if you look at this entire story from beginning to end, from that year 1938 in which a young man named Lee Byung-chul opened a small trading shop of noodles, dried fish and agricultural products in a poor and occupied Korea, to the present day, where the word Samsung appears on phones, televisions, chips, buildings, and sponsorships all over the planet. What you have before you is not just the expansion of a company, it is the complete transformation of a country and a mentality, compressed into less than a century, as if someone had adjusted time and compressed several generations of development into a single race that has not stopped accelerating since then. That shop in Daegu operated within a reality in which the greatest ambition a merchant could have was to secure good routes, reliable contacts, and a constant flow of goods toward neighboring markets. And yet, in the mind of its founder already lived an ambition that did not fit that setting, a kind of structural nonconformity that pushed him to take advantage of wars, crises, and reconstructions as opportunities to make leaps that from the outside seemed impossible. Hence, when the war devastated Korea and forced him to flee, he used destruction as a lever to enter the food industry, and later the textile industry, and later insurance, banking, construction, electronics, chips, and phones, until transforming the brand that began selling basic products into a true symbol of global modernity. The key to that journey lies not only in the ability to diversify, but in the way of understanding risk as a constant companion, almost like a shadow walking beside every important decision, because along the way, the company has bet enormous amounts on sectors that could have sunk it. Entering electronics when Korea meant very little in that field, building semiconductor factories at a time when the country still carried deep war scars, confronting established giants in televisions and later in smartphones, or daring to launch foldable screens when it was not even clear that the public wanted something like that. If this story serves any purpose from an entrepreneurial perspective, it is to remind us that the companies that end up shaping an industry are those that dare to enter places where there is still no map, and that are willing to pay the price of mistakes when that map is drawn through stumbles. There is also a constant that goes beyond specific products. That drive for integration that leads Samsung to want to control as much as it can of the value chain. From the grain of sugar to the loaf of bread, from the fiber to the fabric, from the tiny transistor to the giant screen in the living room, from the chip that no one sees inside a server to the phone that everyone recognizes in a user's hand. This mentality of building a complete industrial ecosystem has given the group an impressive strength when it comes to withstanding crises, because when television demand fell, chips kept pulling. When the mobile landscape became complicated, memory and screen contracts continued entering. When the domestic market suffered, exports kept working. And thus, stretch by stretch, the conglomerate has withstood waves that left others out of the game. But it would be misleading to tell this story as a perfect chain of successes without pausing at the human, social, and ethical costs it has had. The group's rapid growth has relied on an extremely tough work culture, with long hours, enormous pressure on employees and executives, and a conception of success in which personal sacrifice was understood almost as a moral obligation. The Chaebol model, with its mix of concentrated family power and state support, has created wealth and employment. But it has also generated strong tensions with unions, small businesses, and citizens who see how a few families accumulate an overwhelming weight in the country's economy. Corruption scandals, trials of the leadership, investigations into controversial mergers or political influence are not footnotes, they are part of the narrative, and they remind us that great corporate stories often walk a very thin line between the construction and the abuse of power. Something similar can be said about the global impact. Millions of people benefit from Samsung technology, from affordable screens, powerful phones, and increasingly efficient appliances. And at the same time, on the other side of the coin, there are factories that must adjust their processes to a brutal level of demand, competitive pressures that force the optimization of every cent, and a global race for labor, suppliers, and resources that does not always treat all actors with the same fairness. Understanding the magnitude of Samsung implies accepting this duality. On one hand, it is an inspiring story of ambition and reinvention. On the other, it is a reminder that no industrial giant rises without leaving deep marks on the ground it steps on. However, when you return to the starting point and remember that all of this began with a young man walking through the streets of an impoverished and occupied Korea, searching for a way to earn money by trading products that fit into sacks and boxes, it is hard not to see in this trajectory an extreme demonstration of the multiplying effect of time when combined with a clear vision and an unrelenting capacity for execution. In less than 100 years, the company goes from sending noodles to China to sending chips to data centers that power artificial intelligence models, from organizing cart and truck routes to managing global logistics chains that move millions of phones and televisions, from dealing with colonial inspectors to sitting down to negotiate with governments on every continent about strategic semiconductor factories. And you, who right now may be listening to this story, from the very Samsung phone with which you watch videos, work, talk to your family, or browse your social networks, are part of the last link in that chain, because each time you turn on the screen or receive a notification, you are activating an industrial and technological mechanism that was built piece by piece over decades. Behind the seemingly trivial gesture of sliding your finger across the screen, there is a thread that connects those first boxes of goods in Daegu, the bombs falling during the Korean War, the first black and white televisions that changed the living rooms of many families, the clean rooms where microscopic chips are manufactured, the trials that decided the future of the Lee family, the meetings in which someone decided to bet on a foldable phone when many laughed at the idea. The history of Samsung, seen from afar, may seem like that of just another brand in the technological landscape, but if you walk through it slowly, you discover that in reality it is a mirror where almost all the forces that have defined the modern world are reflected: war, reconstruction, accelerated industrialization, alliance between state and business, globalization, digital revolution, data commerce, artificial intelligence, and, of course, the ethical dilemmas that accompany any concentration of power. The extraordinary thing is that, unlike other industrial giants that had centuries to grow, here everything has happened within the span of the memory of a single family, of 3 generations united by the same surname, who have passed the baton of an ambition that began with 3 stars drawn in the mind of a young merchant. Perhaps, when you see the Samsung logo again on a screen or on a facade, something more than the idea of a specific product will come to mind. Maybe you will remember that young man in Daegu, the war, the chip factories, the scandals, the foldable screens, the artificial intelligence, and the entire path that had to be traveled so that name could go from being written on the door of a noodle shop to becoming one of the most recognizable symbols of contemporary technology. And then you will understand that behind every global myth there is an immense accumulation of decisions, successes, mistakes, and entire lives dedicated to pushing a company a little further every day. And this is where this journey through the history of Samsung comes to an end, an incredible trajectory that continues transforming the world we live in. If you enjoyed it, tell me in the comments which part surprised you the most and which company you would like to discover in a future episode. Do not forget to subscribe so you can join me every night for new stories of entrepreneurship. Good night.